Samantha Hayes was exhausted. It had been another grueling day at the Grand Lexington Hotel, where she worked as a cleaning staff member. Ever since she agreed to take on double shifts to cover for a sick coworker, her body had been pushed to its absolute limit. She barely had time to sleep, let alone take care of herself. Tonight, the presidential suite was the last room on her list. It was the most luxurious space in the entire hotel, frequently booked by celebrities, politicians, and high-profile business executives. Normally, Samantha would have been in awe of the sheer elegance surrounding her. Golden chandeliers, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows with a breathtaking city view. But tonight, she could barely keep her eyes open. She moved on autopilot, scrubbing the countertops, dusting the furniture, and changing the extravagant silk bed sheets. The last task left was the bathroom, practically the size of her entire apartment. She grabbed her mop and walked inside, inhaling the fresh scent of lavender and expensive cologne lingering in the air. 5 more minutes, she whispered to herself. She bent down to clean the base of the toilet, but as soon as she leaned her head against her arm for just a second, her body gave in. The exhaustion was overwhelming, pulling her into sleep right there on the closed toilet lid. Samantha had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Daniel Kensington entered the Grand Lexington Hotel lobby, his expression unreadable. The billionaire CEO of Kensington Enterprises was known for his sharp mind, cold efficiency, and an unshakable reputation as one of the most ruthless businessmen in the city. He had just finished back-to-back investor meetings and was in dire need of a moment to himself. As he stepped into the private elevator leading to his penthouse suite, he loosened his tie and sighed. He had built his empire from the ground up, working tirelessly to maintain his status. But with great success came great loneliness. Everyone in his world wanted something from him. Business deals, investments, power. He was surrounded by people, but truly knew no one. When the elevator doors opened, Daniel strode into his suite, tossing his suit jacket onto the couch. He made his way to the bathroom, intending to splash some cold water on his face to clear his mind. But the moment he opened the door, he nearly had a heart attack. There, curled up on the toilet lid, was a woman, asleep. Daniel's pulse quickened. Who the hell was she? A burglar? A crazed fan? His mind instantly jumped to worst-case scenarios. "Excuse me?" he said sharply. No response. His brows furrowed. He took a cautious step closer, noticing the hotel uniform she wore. A cleaning staff member? That was when he saw it. The sheer exhaustion on her face, dark circles under her eyes, her body completely limp as if she hadn't slept in days. Instead of anger, something unexpected stirred in his chest. She looked fragile. Daniel, a man feared in boardrooms and respected in financial circles, stood frozen, utterly unsure of what to do. Just then, Samantha stirred, blinking groggily. Her gaze landed on the tall, sharply dressed man in front of her, and in an instant, she realized her mistake. "Oh my God!" she yelped, nearly falling off the toilet lid. She scrambled to stand, knocking over the mop bucket in the process. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Oh no, your shoes!" She gasped as she noticed the expensive Italian leather shoes now soaked in soapy water. Daniel glanced down, then back at her, and to his own surprise, he laughed. Samantha froze. Of all the reactions she expected, laughter wasn't one of them. "You fell asleep," Daniel said, a smirk playing on his lips. "On my toilet. Her face turned scarlet. I I didn't mean to. I was just I was just cleaning, and I guess I was really tired and oh God, you're going to fire me, aren't you? Daniel tilted his head, observing her. She had panic written all over her face, like someone who was used to getting the short end of the stick in life. That depends, he said smoothly. Do you usually nap in hotel bathrooms? No, absolutely not, Samantha insisted, horrified. I just, I work double shifts, and my body kind of gave up. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Normally, he wouldn't waste his time with something like this. He had no patience for incompetence. But something about her honesty, her exhaustion, the way she clearly worked herself to the bone, made him pause. Instead of firing her, he found himself saying something completely out of character. Have you eaten? Samantha blinked. What? Have you eaten? He repeated, enunciating each word slowly, as if talking to a child. Samantha frowned. I had a granola bar this morning. Daniel exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed. He turned on his heel and walked out of the bathroom. Samantha stood frozen for a moment before realizing she should probably run for her life. But just as she turned to grab her mop, she heard him call out from the other room. Come here. Hesitantly, she stepped out of the bathroom. To her surprise, Daniel was in the kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee. Sit, he instructed, motioning toward the sleek bar stool. I really should finish cleaning, she mumbled. I own this hotel, he said flatly. So unless you want me to personally fire you, sit. Samantha gulped. What kind of choice was that? Reluctantly, she sat. Daniel slid the cup of coffee in front of her. Drink. She picked up the cup cautiously, sniffed, and made a face. This is terrible, she blurted before she could stop herself. Daniel arched a brow. Excuse me. She immediately backpedaled. I mean, it's a bit burnt. The beans are probably over roasted, and someone definitely added too much sugar to try and cover it up, but it only made it worse. Daniel stared at her. Samantha wanted to melt into the floor. She had just insulted the coffee in his penthouse. If she wasn't already fired, she definitely would be now. But then Daniel grinned. Interesting, he said. You figured all that out just from a sip. Yeah. His grin widened. Samantha had no idea that, at that moment, Daniel Kensington had just made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Samantha stared at Daniel in confusion. He was still watching her with that unreadable expression, as if she had just solved some impossible equation. The moment felt absurd. 1 second, she was about to get fired for sleeping in a billionaire's bathroom. And now he was grinning at her over a cup of burnt coffee. She cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. So, am I fired? Daniel leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. No, that should have been a relief. But instead, she felt even more unsettled. Then why are you looking at me like that? Because I don't come across people like you very often, he said simply. She frowned. People like me? He smirked. People who say exactly what they think, even when they shouldn't. Her face turned red. Oh, I didn't mean to be rude about the coffee. It's just, you were right. She stopped rambling. What? Daniel gestured to the cup in her hands. The coffee. You were right about it. The beans are over roasted, and the sugar is excessive. Samantha blinked at him. You agree? He gave a small shrug. It's terrible. I just never put much thought into it. She frowned, looking down at the cup. She was used to being dismissed, ignored, or scolded when she spoke her mind. But here was Daniel Kensington, one of the most powerful businessmen in the city, telling her she was right. I'm good at noticing things, she admitted hesitantly. It's kind of my thing. Daniel tilted his head. Noticing things? Flavors, smells, textures, small details most people overlook. His eyes gleamed with curiosity. So if I brought you more things to taste, you could tell me what's wrong with them? Samantha let out a short laugh. What is this? A weird job interview? Daniel didn't laugh. Maybe. She stared at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. He didn't seem like the kind of man who wasted time on random conversations. Everything about him was sharp, efficient, precise. If he was still talking to her, that meant something. I don't know, she said cautiously. I've never done anything like that before. I just notice things because I have to. Why? Samantha hesitated. No one ever really asked about her life. No one cared enough to. But for some reason, she found herself answering. Because I grew up in foster homes, she said quietly. When you don't have much, you learn to appreciate the small details. Food was one of them. It was the only thing that ever felt real. Daniel didn't react right away. He studied her, his gaze unreadable again. But this time, there was something softer in it. You never considered working in food? He asked. She scoffed. I barely finished high school. Culinary school wasn't exactly an option. He was quiet for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he picked up his phone and typed something quickly. What are you doing? She asked. Making a call? He said. I want you to come to the hotel's restaurant tomorrow morning. Samantha blinked. For what? I want you to taste the menu. She nearly choked. What? Why? Daniel put his phone down and looked at her. Because if you're as good as I think you are, I might have a different job for you. Her mind was spinning. You're offering me a job? You don't even know me. He smirked. I know enough. Samantha's heart pounded. This was insane. Absolutely insane. She was a cleaning staff member who had literally fallen asleep in his bathroom, and now he wanted her to critique the Grand Lexington Hotel's restaurant menu. I don't think that's a good idea, she said quickly. Why not? She looked down at her hands. Because this isn't my world. I don't belong in fancy restaurants, judging expensive dishes. Daniel's voice was calm but firm. Maybe that's exactly why you should. Samantha didn't know how to respond. She had spent her whole life fitting into small spaces, avoiding risks, staying invisible. And now, a man like Daniel Kensington was looking at her like she was worth something more. She swallowed hard. I'll think about it. He nodded, as if already knowing what her answer would be. Good. She expected him to dismiss her then, to send her back to her shift like nothing had happened. Instead, he grabbed another cup, poured himself coffee, and leaned against the counter like they were just two ordinary people having a conversation. You really need better coffee, she muttered, taking another sip. Daniel chuckled. Then you'd better show up tomorrow and help me fix it. Samantha had no idea how, but she knew this conversation had just changed the course of her entire life. Samantha barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, her thoughts spun in endless circles. The idea of stepping into the Grand Lexington Hotel's restaurant not as a cleaning staff member, but as someone whose opinion mattered, felt too surreal to be real. She should say no. That was the logical answer. She had spent years building a life that didn't allow for disappointment, and saying yes to Daniel Kensington's ridiculous offer felt like walking straight into a disaster. But deep down, she knew she had already made her decision. By the time morning arrived, Samantha was exhausted, but she still got up early and put on the cleanest, most professional-looking outfit she owned. It wasn't much, just a simple black blouse and jeans, but it was the best she had. She tied her hair back, grabbed her worn-out sneakers, and tried not to overthink it as she made her way to the restaurant. When she walked in, the place was already buzzing with movement. Waiters in crisp white shirts carried trays of expensive breakfast dishes. Chefs worked behind the open kitchen counter, and guests who looked like they belonged to another world entirely sat at perfectly arranged tables. She immediately felt out of place. Daniel was standing near the bar, dressed in a tailored dark suit, casually scrolling through his phone. Even in a room full of important people, he was the one who stood out. When he spotted her, he put his phone away and walked toward her. "You're on time." Samantha raised an eyebrow. Surprised? A little. She exhaled, gripping the strap of her bag. "This is a mistake." Daniel smirked. "Not yet." He gestured toward a table near the back of the restaurant. "Come on, let's get started." Samantha hesitated before following him. As she sat down, a tall, broad-shouldered man approached. He had the kind of posture that screamed authority, and the sharp glare he shot at her made it clear that he didn't approve of her presence. "This is Chef Laurent, head of the restaurant," Daniel introduced. "Chef, this is Samantha Collins." Laurent didn't even try to hide his skepticism. "And she's here because she's going to taste the breakfast menu," Daniel said casually. The chef blinked, looking genuinely offended. "With all due respect, sir, she is not a food critic." Daniel's expression didn't change. "Neither am I, but that doesn't stop me from knowing when something tastes terrible." Laurent's jaw tightened. Samantha was pretty sure he wanted to strangle Daniel, but instead, he turned to her with a tight smile. "Fine. Let's see what our expert thinks." Moments later, a waiter arrived with a selection of breakfast dishes: fluffy omelets, golden waffles, fresh fruit, and pastries that looked straight out of a magazine. Samantha stared at the food, suddenly hyper-aware that every pair of eyes in the restaurant was watching her. She swallowed hard. "This is ridiculous." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Then prove me wrong." Samantha took a deep breath, picked up her fork, and tried the omelet first. She chewed slowly, analyzing every bite. Then she moved on to the waffles, then the croissant, then the fruit. Laurent crossed his arms. "Well?" Samantha wiped her mouth with a napkin, placed her hands on the table, and told them exactly what she thought. "The omelet is overcooked. The edges are rubbery, which means the pan was too hot. The waffles are good but dry. Either the batter didn't have enough moisture, or they were left sitting too long before serving. The croissant is fine, but it tastes like it was reheated, which means it's probably from yesterday. The fruit is the only thing that doesn't need improvement because, well, it's just fruit." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Laurent's expression was unreadable. Daniel, on the other hand, was grinning like he had just won a bet he knew he wouldn't lose. The chef finally spoke, his voice sharp. "You got all that from one bite?" Samantha shifted uncomfortably under his intense stare. Yes. Laurent studied her for a long moment, then let out a short, humorless laugh. Interesting. He turned to Daniel. What exactly do you want me to do with this information? Fix it, Daniel said simply. Laurent narrowed his eyes. Are you seriously asking me to take advice from a housekeeper? Daniel's expression turned to steel. I'm asking you to take advice from someone who can taste the difference between acceptable and exceptional. If that bothers you, I can always find someone else to run the restaurant. Samantha almost choked on air. Laurent's face turned red, but he kept his voice controlled. That won't be necessary. Good, Daniel said, standing up. He turned to Samantha. Walk with me. Still in shock, Samantha quickly followed him out of the restaurant. The second they stepped into the hallway, she let out a breath. That was impressive, Daniel interrupted. I was going to say terrifying. He smirked. You handled it well. Samantha ran a hand through her hair, still trying to process what had just happened. I can't believe you put me on the spot like that. Daniel shrugged. You did better than expected. She shook her head. Okay, seriously, what is this? I know you didn't drag me in there just for fun. He stopped walking and turned to face her. I want you to work with me. Samantha's heart nearly stopped. What? Daniel crossed his arms. You have a natural talent, Samantha. You see things most people don't. That's rare. She let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, well, talent doesn't exactly pay the bills. Daniel's expression didn't waver. I'll make sure it does. Samantha froze. You're serious? Completely. She stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was all a joke, but he didn't. He just stood there, calm and confident, as if this was the most normal conversation in the world. I don't know anything about working in a restaurant, she admitted. You'll learn. What if I mess up? Daniel smirked. Then you'll figure it out. Samantha opened her mouth to argue, but realized there was nothing left to say. He wasn't offering her charity. He wasn't giving her a favor out of pity. He genuinely believed she could do this. And for the first time in a long time, Samantha wondered if maybe he was right. Samantha barely knew how she got through the rest of the day. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and still couldn't wrap her head around what had just happened. Working alongside Daniel Kensington? The thought was ridiculous. She was a housekeeper, someone who spent her days scrubbing floors and making sure guests had fresh towels. She wasn't some food expert, but then why did the head chef of one of the most prestigious hotels in the city look like she had just insulted his entire existence when she critiqued his dishes? Why did Daniel Kensington, a billionaire CEO, seem so convinced that she belonged in this world? By the time she reached her small apartment that night, she collapsed onto her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Be at the restaurant at 7 a.m. Don't be late. Samantha groaned. She wasn't even sure if she had agreed to this. Yet somehow, he had already decided. But was she really going to turn down the opportunity? She sighed, knowing the answer before she even had the chance to argue with herself. The next morning, she arrived at the restaurant before the sun had even fully risen. She had barely gotten any sleep, but that didn't matter. The moment she stepped through the doors, she felt the weight of 100 eyes on her. Staff members whispered behind their hands. Some just openly stared. It was clear the entire hotel had already heard about the housekeeper turned food critic. Daniel was already there, standing near the kitchen with a cup of coffee in hand. He smirked when he saw her. "You actually showed up." Samantha crossed her arms. "I figured I should at least see what this job actually is before I decide to run for the hills." He gestured toward the kitchen. "Then let's get started." She followed him inside, feeling the tension in the air the moment she stepped in. Chef Laurent was there, standing with his arms crossed, looking like he was barely restraining himself from throwing her out. His entire kitchen staff stood behind him, some looking curious, others looking annoyed. "I still don't understand why she's here," Laurent said, his voice sharp. Daniel didn't even blink. "She's here because I trust her instincts." Laurent scoffed. "With all due respect, instincts don't run a kitchen. Experience does." Daniel shrugged, "Then let her gain experience." The chef turned to Samantha. "Fine. If she's going to be here, she should prove herself." Samantha tensed. "I already. You critiqued food on a plate." "That's easy," Laurent interrupted. "But if you want to have a say in my kitchen, you should know how to actually work in one." Samantha immediately regretted stepping into this room, but before she could protest, Daniel clapped his hands together. "Great idea. Samantha, grab an apron." She snapped her head toward him. "Excuse me?" "You heard him. If you're going to be part of this, you should learn how things work from the inside." Samantha wanted to strangle him. She sighed heavily, grabbed an apron from a nearby rack, and tied it around her waist. The entire kitchen watched her as if she was about to self-destruct. "Fine," she muttered. "What do you want me to do?" Laurent smirked. "Let's start simple. Make an omelet." Samantha's stomach dropped. "You're kidding." Laurent gestured toward the ingredients in front of her. "Go ahead. Show us what you know." Samantha had never cooked in a professional kitchen before. Sure, she made meals at home, but this wasn't the same thing. She glanced at Daniel, hoping he would step in and tell Laurent to back off. But Daniel just stood there, arms crossed, looking far too entertained by the situation. Grinding her teeth, she grabbed a pan and turned on the stove. She cracked the eggs, whisked them quickly, and poured them in. The kitchen was completely silent as she worked. She knew they were all waiting for her to fail. She refused to give them the satisfaction. When she was done, she slid the omelet onto a plate and stepped back. "There." Laurent picked up a fork, cut off a small piece, and tasted it. Then he raised an eyebrow. "It's not bad." Samantha blinked. "What?" "I said it's not bad." Laurent set the fork down. "Your technique is amateur, but you have a natural understanding of flavor." She was too shocked to speak. Daniel chuckled. "Looks like you passed your first test." Laurent huffed but nodded. She has potential. Samantha let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She had expected to be humiliated. Instead, she had just earned the respect of one of the toughest chefs in the city. "All right," Laurent said. "She can stay." Samantha turned to Daniel, still feeling like this was some elaborate joke. "Now what?" Daniel smirked. "Now, you learn." And she did. Over the next few days, Samantha threw herself into the world of the kitchen. She wasn't cooking full-time, but Laurent made sure she understood how every dish was made. She learned about ingredients, flavors, and techniques she had never even heard of before. And with every passing day, she started to believe, just a little, that maybe she belonged here. But of course, not everyone agreed. "Are you sleeping with him?" Samantha nearly dropped the tray of plates she was carrying. She turned to see Julia, one of the front desk receptionists, leaning against the counter with a smug smile. Samantha frowned. "Excuse me?" Julia shrugged. "People talk, you know. One minute you're scrubbing toilets. The next you're sitting at Daniel Kensington's private table, giving orders to chefs." She smirked. "So, are you?" Samantha's blood boiled. "No, I'm not." Julia laughed. "Right. Because he just randomly decided to make you his new project." Samantha clenched her fists. "I don't have time for this." She turned to walk away, but Julia's next words stopped her cold. "Be careful, Samantha. Men like him, they get bored easily." Samantha spun around, her voice sharp. "You don't know anything about him." Julia smirked. "I know enough." Samantha walked away before she could say something she'd regret. But the words stuck with her. Was she really just some temporary amusement to Daniel? The thought made her chest tighten. She shook her head. No, Daniel wasn't like that. He wouldn't have wasted his time on her if he didn't see something real. Right? She hated that she wasn't sure. That night, she left the kitchen later than usual. As she stepped outside, she found Daniel leaning against his car, waiting for her. "What are you still doing here?" she asked. He shrugged. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Samantha sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's been a long day." Daniel studied her for a moment. Something happened. She hesitated. Then, against her better judgment, she asked, "Why are you doing this?" He frowned. "Doing what?" "This." She gestured between them. "Why me?" Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped closer, his voice quieter than before. "Because I see something in you, Samantha. Something you don't see in yourself yet." Her breath hitched. And suddenly, she wasn't so sure she wanted to know what that meant. Samantha couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Daniel's words replayed in her head. "Because I see something in you, Samantha. Something you don't see in yourself yet." She tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that none of this mattered. That she didn't care what Daniel Kensington thought about her. But the truth was, she did. And that scared her more than anything. The next morning, she arrived at the restaurant, determined to push those thoughts aside. But as soon as she stepped into the kitchen, she realized she had much bigger problems to worry about. Everyone was staring at her. The whispers were louder than usual. The looks more pointed. Samantha felt her stomach tighten. She set down her bag and walked straight to Laurent, who was frowning at a newspaper on the counter. "What's going on?" she asked. Laurent sighed and slid the newspaper toward her. Samantha's heart dropped the second she saw the headline. "Millionaire CEO Daniel Kensington's secret affair with housekeeper turned food expert raises eyebrows." She felt the blood drain from her face. "No," she whispered. "Oh, yes," Laurent muttered. "It's everywhere." Samantha quickly skimmed through the article. It painted her as some nobody who had caught Daniel's attention. Someone who was being given special treatment for reasons that had nothing to do with talent. And the worst part? It had quotes from people inside the hotel, anonymous sources who had worked with her. Samantha clenched the newspaper, feeling anger simmer under her skin. "I didn't ask for any of this," she muttered. Laurent studied her for a moment before nodding. "I know, but people love gossip. And this is their favorite kind of story. Samantha took a deep breath. She needed to focus. She wasn't going to let some stupid article ruin everything she had worked for. She had to prove that she deserved to be here, that this wasn't just some ridiculous fling. So she straightened her shoulders and walked to her station. "All right," she said, "let's get to work." Laurent smirked. That's the spirit. But of course, things weren't that simple. Throughout the day, the whispers didn't stop. Every time she walked past a group of employees, she felt their eyes on her. Every time she caught someone staring, they quickly looked away, pretending they weren't just talking about her. By lunchtime, she was ready to scream. That's when Daniel showed up. The second he walked into the restaurant, the entire room seemed to go silent. He was dressed impeccably, as always, his presence commanding attention without even trying. But when his eyes landed on Samantha, something in them softened. He walked straight to her, ignoring the stares, and leaned against the counter. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Samantha clenched her jaw. "Oh, just fantastic. Who doesn't love waking up to find out they're the center of a public scandal?" Daniel's lips twitched, as if he wanted to smile, but knew better. "I'll handle it." She narrowed her eyes. "And how exactly are you going to do that?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the restaurant, taking in the way people were watching them. Then he leaned in a little closer. "Meet me in my office after your shift." Samantha hesitated. "Why?" His expression was unreadable. "Because I have a plan." And then, before she could argue, he turned and walked out, leaving her with 100 new questions and absolutely no answers. The rest of the day dragged on painfully slow. Samantha tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to Daniel. What was he planning? Was this going to make things better or worse? By the time her shift ended, she was exhausted. But she still found herself walking toward Daniel's office, her heart pounding with every step. She knocked once. "Come in." Samantha pushed open the door and stepped inside. Daniel was sitting behind his massive desk, sleeves rolled up, looking more like a man who had spent the day in board meetings than someone who had just become the subject of hotel-wide gossip. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She did. "So, what's this plan of yours?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "We need to get ahead of this." Samantha crossed her arms. "And how do we do that?" He met her gaze. "We tell the truth." She blinked. "What?" "We do an interview," he said. "We set the record straight. Make it clear that you're here because of your talent, not because of whatever ridiculous rumors they're spreading." Samantha stared at him. "You can't be serious." He leaned forward. "Do I look like I'm joking?" She shook her head. "No, but Daniel, an interview? That's just going to make things worse." He studied her for a moment. "You trust me?" She opened her mouth, then hesitated. Did she? Yes, and that was the problem. She sighed. "Fine, but if this backfires, I'm blaming you." Daniel smirked. "Wouldn't expect anything less." The next morning, Samantha found herself sitting across from a journalist, cameras pointed at her, lights shining in her face. She had never done anything like this before. Daniel sat beside her, calm and collected as always. The interview started simple. Questions about her background, how she ended up working at the hotel. But then they got to the real reason they were there. So, the journalist said, glancing at her notes, there have been rumors that your sudden promotion has less to do with talent and more to do with a personal relationship with Mr. Kensington. Samantha clenched her hands in her lap. Daniel didn't hesitate. That's nonsense. The journalist raised an eyebrow. Is it? Daniel turned to Samantha, his expression softer now. I promoted her because she has an incredible gift. She walked into my restaurant and was able to pinpoint every flaw in our menu without even trying. I've worked with some of the best chefs in the world, and I've never seen anyone with instincts like hers. Samantha's breath caught. He wasn't just defending her, he was believing in her. The journalist turned to Samantha. And what do you have to say about the rumors? Samantha took a deep breath. I won't pretend it's been easy. People love to talk. But I'm not here because of Daniel. I'm here because I worked hard to be here. And if anyone doubts that, they're welcome to step into the kitchen and see for themselves. Daniel smirked. The interview ended soon after, and Samantha felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. But for the first time, she also felt something else. Confidence. As they left the interview, Daniel looked over at her. See? That wasn't so bad. She shot him a look. I hate you. He laughed. No, you don't. And the worst part? He was right. Samantha thought the storm had passed. The interview had gone better than expected, and for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. Maybe, just maybe, people would start seeing her for her talent instead of the scandal they wanted to believe in. But the universe had a cruel sense of humor, and peace never lasted long. The next morning, as she walked into the restaurant, she felt it immediately. The shift in energy, the way people looked at her. It wasn't the same judgmental curiosity as before. This was something else. Laurent was the first to approach her, a grim expression on his face. He handed her his phone without a word. Samantha's stomach twisted as she read the headline. Samantha Hayes, the real story behind the cleaning lady turned chef and her connection to Daniel Kensington. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she scrolled. The article didn't just question her abilities. It dragged up everything. It detailed her financial struggles, how she had worked multiple jobs to survive, even mentioning the eviction notice she had barely managed to escape months ago. Every piece of her life that she had fought to keep private was now laid bare for the world to see. And then there was the worst part. They had interviewed her former employer from a small diner she had worked at years ago. The owner, a bitter man who had never appreciated her skills, had told them she was unreliable, that she had been fired for talking back, that she wasn't special, just another desperate woman who got lucky. Samantha shoved the phone back at Laurent and turned away, her breathing shaky. Who wrote this? She asked, her voice tight. Laurent sighed. I don't know, but they clearly had an agenda. They didn't just find this on their own, Sam. Someone gave them this information. Samantha didn't need to think hard to figure out who. There was only one person ruthless enough to go this far. Meline. She had lost the battle, but she was determined to win the war. Samantha didn't realize she was shaking until Laurent gently squeezed her arm. You okay? She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. I will be. But that was a lie, because when she stepped into the kitchen, the whispers followed her again. She could feel the shift in the way people spoke to her. Before, the gossip had been fueled by speculation. Now they thought they had proof. Proof that she didn't belong. Proof that she was exactly what they had accused her of being. She kept her head down and focused on her work, refusing to let it break her. But by the time her shift ended, exhaustion, both physical and emotional, had settled deep into her bones. She needed air. Without thinking, she found herself walking toward Daniel's office. She hesitated for only a second before knocking. "Come in." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Daniel was at his desk, staring at his laptop with a frown. He looked up the second he saw her, and his expression immediately shifted. "You saw it," he said. It wasn't a question. Samantha let out a short, bitter laugh. Hard to miss when half the staff is reading it like it's the Bible. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I should have seen this coming." She crossed her arms, trying to steady herself. She won't stop, will she? Daniel's jaw tightened. Milene never stops until she gets what she wants. Samantha swallowed hard. And what does she want? He exhaled slowly. "To control me. And right now, you're the one thing she can't control." Something in his voice sent a shiver down Samantha's spine. "Daniel." She hesitated. Why does she hate me so much? He was silent for a long moment before answering. "Because you make me question everything." Her breath caught in her throat. Daniel stood and walked around his desk, stopping just a few inches away from her. He was close enough that she could smell the faint scent of his cologne, feel the warmth radiating from him. "I built my life around rules, Samantha, around expectations. Milene was part of that world, and for a long time, I thought I had to play by those rules. But then you came along and turned everything upside down." She swallowed. "I didn't mean to." He smiled slightly. "I know." For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Don't let her win," he murmured. "You belong here, and I don't give a damn what anyone else thinks." Samantha wanted to believe him. She really did. But the weight of everything was too much. "What if I don't belong, Daniel?" she whispered. "What if they're right?" His expression darkened. "They're not." "But—" He didn't let her finish. "Do you trust me?" She hesitated, then slowly, she nodded. "Good," he said. "Because I have a plan." Samantha arched an eyebrow. "Another one?" His lips twitched. "This one's better." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Fine. What is it?" Daniel leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "We fight back." She gave him a dry look. "And how exactly do we do that?" "Buy a bigger newspaper and print our own story?" "Not quite," he said, smirking, "but close." Samantha groaned. "Why do I feel like I'm going to regret this?" Daniel just smiled. "Trust me, Hayes, this is going to be fun." And despite everything, despite the rumors, the exhaustion, the chaos, she found herself smiling back. Because maybe, just maybe, she was ready to fight. Samantha sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the ceiling as Daniel's words replayed in her mind. "We fight back." It was easier said than done. She had spent her entire life keeping her head down, trying to avoid conflict. But this wasn't something she could just ignore. The article had torn apart her reputation, painted her as nothing more than a lucky fraud. And worst of all, it had made her doubt herself. Daniel believed in her. He was so sure that she deserved to be here. But what if he was wrong? She shook her head, pushing the thought away. No, she wasn't going to let Malene or anyone else dictate her worth. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Meet me in the lobby in 10 minutes. Wear something nice. She frowned. Nice? She typed back. Trust me. Samantha sighed and got up. She had no idea what he was planning, but at this point, she had learned that questioning Daniel Kensington was pointless. 15 minutes later, she walked into the hotel lobby, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress. Daniel was waiting near the entrance, looking sharp in a tailored navy blue suit. He glanced up as she approached, his gaze sweeping over her with an unreadable expression. You clean up well, Hayes, he said with a smirk. She rolled her eyes. If this is another test, I swear it's not. He extended his arm. Come on. We have somewhere to be. She hesitated for a second before slipping her hand into the crook of his arm. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, but she ignored it. They stepped outside, where a sleek black car was waiting. Are you kidnapping me? She asked dryly as he opened the door for her. Daniel chuckled. You'd like that, wouldn't you? She shot him a glare before sliding into the car. As they drove through the city, Samantha tried to guess where they were going, but Daniel remained tight-lipped. Finally, they pulled up in front of an upscale restaurant, the kind of place where people made reservations months in advance. Daniel, she said slowly, eyeing the extravagant gold lettering on the door. Why are we here? He smiled. To remind people who you are. Before she could ask what that meant, he was already leading her inside. The restaurant was stunning. Dimly lit chandeliers, velvet drapes, and waiters who moved with the precision of dancers. It was the kind of place where the elite gathered, where reputations were made or destroyed over a single dinner. And judging by the way heads turned when they walked in, their presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Samantha felt her stomach tighten. Daniel leaned in and whispered, Relax, you belong here. She took a breath and nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. A waiter led them to a private table near the center of the room. As they sat, Samantha noticed familiar faces among the other diners. Critics, investors, journalists, the people who shaped the food industry. And then she saw her, Malene, seated a few tables away, dressed in a silk gown, sipping wine as if she owned the place. When her eyes met Samantha's, her lips curled into a knowing smile. Samantha clenched her fists. Daniel must have noticed because he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. The gesture startled her, but the warmth of his palm was grounding. Ignore her, he said softly. Tonight isn't about her. She exhaled and nodded. The waiter arrived, and Daniel ordered without looking at the menu. She wasn't surprised. Of course, he knew exactly what to get. As they waited for their food, Samantha leaned forward. Tell me the plan. Daniel smirked. Patience, Hayes. Just enjoy the evening. She narrowed her eyes. That sounds suspiciously like something a man says before dropping a bombshell. He chuckled. Maybe. Before she could demand more answers, their food arrived, and that's when she realized what he had done. The dishes were the same ones she had critiqued at the hotel. The ones she had said needed improvement. Her heart pounded as she took a bite. The flavors had changed, precisely in the way she had suggested. The acidity was balanced, the seasoning refined. It was perfect. She looked up at Daniel in shock. You, she shook her head. You told the chef to change it? He took a sip of his wine. Not just any chef, the head chef of this restaurant. He's been following your feedback. Samantha's mind spun. But why? Daniel set his glass down and leaned closer. Because you were right, Hayes. You have an instinct for this. And now, everyone in this room is eating proof of it. Her stomach flipped. She glanced around. People were murmuring, nodding in approval, savoring their meals. And then, to her horror, the head chef himself approached their table. Miss Hayes, he said, with a polite smile, it's a pleasure to meet you. Samantha swallowed hard. Likewise. He nodded toward her plate. Do you approve of the changes? She hesitated. Then she looked at Daniel, at the quiet confidence in his eyes, and turned back to the chef. It's perfect, she said. The chef beamed. Excellent. I'd love to have you visit the kitchen sometime. Your insights have been invaluable. She nodded, barely able to process what was happening. As the chef walked away, Samantha turned to Daniel. I don't even know what to say. He smirked. Thank you is a good start. She rolled her eyes. You're impossible. His expression softened. Maybe. But I meant what I said, Samantha. You belong in this world. And tonight, everyone else knows it too. Her heart swelled. For the first time since this whole mess started, she felt like she was winning. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. Samantha stood on the restaurant balcony, gripping the edge of the railing as the cool night air wrapped around her. The city lights stretched endlessly before her, a shimmering sea of possibilities. Just hours ago, she had sat at a table surrounded by some of the most influential people in the industry, people who now looked at her with respect rather than skepticism. And it was all because of Daniel, because he believed in her when she hadn't even believed in herself. She heard the sound of footsteps behind her and didn't have to turn around to know it was him. You disappeared? Daniel's voice was calm, but there was a hint of something else. Concern, maybe. Samantha let out a slow breath. Just needed a moment. He stepped closer, standing beside her, his hands slipping into the pockets of his suit. A moment for what? She glanced at him, then back at the city. To process everything. Daniel was silent for a beat. Then, he said, I told you that you belonged here. She huffed a small laugh. You did, and I almost didn't believe you. He turned to face her fully, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Do you believe me now? She swallowed, the weight of the evening settling into her bones. I think I'm starting to. A small smirk tugged at his lips. Good. Samantha shook her head, looking down at her hands. I've spent my whole life thinking I had to keep my head down, that if I just worked hard and stayed out of the way, maybe I'd be okay. But being here tonight, watching people actually listen to me, it's terrifying. Daniel tilted his head. Why? Because if I let myself believe I deserve this, then I have something to lose. His expression softened in a way that made her chest tighten. You're not going to lose, Samantha. She sighed. You don't know that. I do, he said without hesitation, because you're not the same woman who fell asleep on a bathroom lid. You're not just surviving anymore. You're fighting. His words struck something deep inside her, something raw and fragile. She turned to him, really looking at him, and for the first time, she saw more than just the confident CEO. She saw the man who had pushed her forward when she was too afraid to take the next step. "Why did you do all of this?" she asked quietly. Daniel studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because I saw something in you that you didn't see in yourself." Her heart pounded. "And that's it?" His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say more, but then he hesitated. Whatever was running through his mind, he was holding it back. Finally, he stepped away. "Come on, it's late. Let's get you back to the hotel." Disappointment flickered inside her, but she didn't push. The ride back was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel, his other resting casually on the console between them. Every so often, she caught him glancing at her, but he never said anything. When they pulled up to the hotel, Samantha hesitated before reaching for the door handle. "Daniel." He turned to her, waiting. She searched for the right words, but ended up saying the only thing that truly mattered. "Thank you." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "Get some rest, Hayes. Big day tomorrow." She nodded and stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of his gaze on her as she walked inside. As soon as she reached her room, she collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. Her entire life had changed in just a few days. And Daniel. She squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't let herself think about him like that. Not now. But even as exhaustion pulled her under, she knew the thought of him wasn't going away anytime soon. When she had asked why he had done all of this for her, he had an answer. He just wasn't ready to say it. She turned on her side, frustration bubbling in her chest. What was she expecting? A confession? Some dramatic declaration that he had feelings for her? No, that wasn't Daniel Scott. He was controlled, measured, always thinking 3 steps ahead. And yet, there were cracks in that armor. Small moments when she caught him looking at her, like she was something more than just an employee, something more than just a woman he had chosen to mentor. Samantha exhaled and sat up, rubbing her temples. Maybe she was reading into things too much. Maybe she was just tired. Or maybe she was scared of what it would mean if she was right. The knock at her door made her jump. She glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. Who? Her heart stuttered in her chest. She knew before she even reached for the handle. When she opened the door, Daniel was standing there, hands in his pockets, looking for all the world like he had made a terrible mistake showing up. "Scott," she said, surprised. His jaw clenched slightly, as if he wasn't sure what to say now that he was actually here. Finally, he exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "Can I come in?" Samantha hesitated. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how he operated, but she stepped aside anyway. Daniel walked in, stopping a few feet away from her, his gaze scanning the room before settling back on her. There was something different in his expression. "You didn't look okay when I dropped you off," he finally said. She blinked. "You came all the way back here because you thought I wasn't okay?" He didn't answer immediately, just studied her with that same intensity that always left her feeling exposed. Something changed tonight, didn't it? Samantha crossed her arms, suddenly feeling defensive. "What do you mean?" "You," he said simply. "You walked into that dinner thinking you didn't belong, but by the end, you were holding your own. And now you're here, alone, questioning everything." She swallowed hard. "And what about you? You looked like you wanted to say something earlier." Daniel's lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was lower, quieter. I did. A thick silence settled between them. Samantha's pulse pounded in her ears. Then say it. Daniel let out a quiet laugh, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was frustrated. You make it sound so simple. Isn't it? He took a slow step toward her. No, Hayes, it's not. Her breath caught. Why not? His eyes flickered over her face, searching for something. Because if I say it, I can't take it back. Samantha's heart felt like it might explode. Then don't take it back. For the first time since she had met him, Daniel Scott hesitated. The man who always knew what to do, what to say, was standing in front of her completely unguarded. And then, before she could process what was happening, he closed the distance between them. His lips brushed against hers, just barely, as if waiting for her to pull away. But she didn't. She couldn't. Samantha reached up, gripping his shirt, pulling him closer, and suddenly, that hesitation disappeared. His hands cupped her face, his kiss deepening, urgent and consuming. It was everything she hadn't let herself admit she wanted, everything she had been afraid to want. By the time they pulled apart, her breath was shaky, and his forehead was pressed against hers. This is insane, she whispered. Completely, he agreed, his thumb grazing her cheek. Her eyes searched his, her mind racing. Daniel, what are we doing? He sighed, resting his hands on her waist. I don't know, but I don't want to stop. Neither did she. But the question still lingered in the air between them. What happened now? Samantha had always thought she knew herself. She had spent years building walls, learning how to stand on her own, refusing to rely on anyone. But in the days following that night with Daniel, she felt like she was unraveling in the best and most terrifying way. He didn't avoid her. If anything, he was more present than ever. He still maintained his composed professional demeanor in public, but in private, something had shifted. His eyes lingered longer. His touch, even the briefest brush of fingers as he handed her a menu or guided her through a crowded room, sent a quiet thrill through her. It was dangerous, whatever this was, and yet Samantha couldn't walk away. On their last night in Paris, they attended a final gala, a closing event filled with Michelin-starred chefs, luxury investors, and the elite of the culinary world. Samantha wore a deep emerald dress, one Carla had forced her to buy before the trip, claiming she needed something that made her feel like she belonged. You look beautiful, Daniel murmured when she stepped into the hotel lobby. Her breath hitched, but she forced a small smirk. Careful, Scott. People might think you actually have feelings. His lips twitched, but his gaze remained serious. That would be unfortunate. He offered his arm, and she took it, ignoring the way her heartbeat quickened at the simple gesture. The gala was grander than anything she had ever attended. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling. The air was filled with the hum of conversation, the scent of gourmet dishes wafting from passing trays. Samantha had been nervous before, but not anymore, because this time she knew she belonged. She moved through the room with confidence, engaging in conversations about flavors, techniques, the future of the industry. And Daniel was watching her the entire time, something almost unreadable in his expression. At one point, she was speaking with an older chef who had spent decades in the industry when she felt a familiar presence beside her. Pardon me, Daniel said smoothly, placing a hand on the small of her back. May I steal Samantha for a moment? The chef chuckled and nodded. Of course, Mr. Scott. You're a lucky man to have such a sharp palate on your team. Daniel didn't respond. simply guiding Samantha toward the balcony. The night air was crisp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. Samantha turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "You're acting strange." "Am I?" "You keep watching me like I'm about to disappear." Daniel exhaled, leaning against the stone railing. "Maybe I just like looking at you." Her stomach flipped. "Scott!" "I don't do this," he interrupted, his voice lower now. "I don't mix work and emotions. I don't get attached." Samantha swallowed, bracing herself. "And yet?" His jaw tensed. "And yet, here we are." Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Samantha didn't know what to say. Maybe he was looking for an out. Maybe he was warning her before he inevitably shut her out completely. But then he reached for her hand. "I want you to stay," she blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What?" "When we go back. I don't want you going back to scrubbing floors and folding sheets. I want you to stay with me, work with me." A lump formed in her throat. "Daniel, I know what people will say. I know how this looks." He tightened his grip on her hand. "But I don't care." Her breath came uneven. It was one thing to share stolen kisses, to pretend this was just something temporary. But this was real. "I don't want to be just another decision you make," she whispered. He shook his head. "You're not. This isn't a decision. It's the only thing that's made sense in a long time." Samantha felt everything around her blur. The sounds of laughter from inside, the faint clinking of champagne glasses, it all faded. Because this man, the one who built his life on control and power, was standing in front of her, choosing her. So, for once in her life, she let herself choose him back. She stepped closer, tilting her chin up. "Then I guess I'm staying." Daniel exhaled, something like relief flickering in his eyes before he pulled her into him. And when he kissed her, it wasn't like before. It wasn't hesitant or questioning. It was certain. It was everything. Paris had changed them. But Samantha knew the real challenge would be what happened next. Because love wasn't just about choosing each other in the heat of the moment. It was about choosing each other every single day after that. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to try. Samantha's story is more than just an unexpected romance between a millionaire CEO and a woman who once scrubbed floors for a living. It is a testament to resilience, to the power of believing in oneself, even when the world insists you don't belong. It is about taking risks, pushing past fear, and allowing yourself to step into a future that once felt impossible. From the moment she fell asleep on that bathroom lid, Samantha's life was set on an unpredictable course. She could have lost everything that night: her job, her dignity, any chance of proving she was more than just a background worker. Instead, she gained something greater: a chance to redefine her own worth. Daniel saw something in her that she had never dared to acknowledge in herself. Not just talent, but potential. A mind that could analyze flavors with precision. A sharp tongue that refused to back down. And a heart that, despite everything, still had the courage to care. But this story is not about a man saving a woman. It is about a woman who, despite years of being overlooked, saved herself. For years, Samantha believed she had to stay within her lane, that society had already dictated her place in the world. But life does not adhere to the rules we think we must follow. It is messy, unpredictable, and full of opportunities that often appear when we least expect them. The question is whether we are brave enough to seize them. Samantha could have walked away from Paris, from Daniel, from the world that told her she didn't fit in. But walking away would have meant surrendering to fear. Instead, she stayed. She faced judgment, whispers, and stares from people who saw her as nothing more than a passing scandal. She refused to let their opinions define her. How often do we let the voices of others dictate our choices? How many times have we told ourselves we aren't good enough simply because the world has not yet recognized our worth? Samantha's journey reminds us that value is not determined by wealth, status, or background. It is determined by who we choose to be when no one else is watching. Daniel, too, had his own transformation. A man who had built his empire on control and logic. He never expected to fall for someone like Samantha. She disrupted his world, challenged his rules, and made him feel something he had long ignored: genuine emotion. Love was never in his plan, but the best things in life rarely are. Together, they proved that love is not about perfection. It is about growth. It is about two people choosing each other despite their differences, despite their pasts, despite the walls they have built around themselves. Love is not always easy, but it is always worth the risk. Their story is a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary moments in life come from the most ordinary places. A hotel bathroom, a cup of terrible coffee, a spontaneous trip to Paris. It is never about where we start, but about where we allow ourselves to go. For anyone who has ever felt like they don't belong, like their dreams are too big, or their circumstances too limiting, Samantha's journey is proof that the world will always make room for those who refuse to be invisible. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own dreams, your own fears, your own untapped potential, then don't let it end here. Join us as we continue to share stories that inspire, that challenge, that remind us of the infinite possibilities waiting just beyond our comfort zones. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and be part of a community that believes in second chances, in bold choices, and in love that defies expectations, because your story is still being written. And who knows, the next chapter might just be the one that changes everything.